6 entire civilizations disappeared from this planet before our recorded history even began, and the Sumerians, the oldest civilization we recognize, left behind their names. And what is even stranger, they wrote it down on clay tablets that are still sitting in museums right now, waiting, telling us something we have been refusing to hear for over 100 years. Right now, in museums and university storage vaults across the world, there are clay tablets, thousands of them, that describe a world that should not have existed. A world where kings ruled for 36,000 years. A world where cities had names and organized governments and written records before we were even supposed to know how to grow food. A world that was so completely destroyed, wiped so clean from the face of the earth, that the only surviving evidence of it is a few dozen lines of text carved into baked clay by a scribe who lived 4,000 years ago, trying to preserve the memory of something even older. But those aren't the only lines. Because on 6 different parts of this planet, in 6 different bodies of evidence, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, the exact same story keeps showing up. A story about a world that existed before this one. A world that was advanced. A world that was thriving. And a world that was destroyed. The Sumerians wrote about 5 cities and 8 kings who ruled before a catastrophic flood and left behind 241,200 years of recorded reign. The ancient Egyptians described a golden age called Zep Tepi, the first time, when divine beings built the original civilization and then disappeared. Plato described Atlantis, a massive civilization in the Atlantic Ocean that sank in a single night, basing his account on Egyptian priest records that were 9,000 years old at the time. In Japan, divers found massive stone structures sitting on the bottom of the ocean in water that was dry land 10,000 years ago. In the Indus Valley, a civilization larger than ancient Egypt left behind 5,000 inscribed objects, and we still cannot read a single word. This video is going to take you through all of it, what the records actually say, what the physical evidence actually shows, and why the full picture points to something that mainstream history has been very slow to admit. We are not the first advanced civilization on this planet. We are the 7th. And if 6 civilizations came before us, if 6 entire worlds rose, peaked, and were erased, then the question is not just where they went. The question is whether we are paying attention to the reason they're gone. Stay with me. By the end of this, you're going to see ancient history in a completely different way. Let's start at the beginning. The real beginning. The year is 1906. A place called Nippur in what is now modern Iraq. The ancient region called Mesopotamia, which means the land between the rivers. A team connected to the University of Pennsylvania had been excavating there for years, pulling up crates of clay tablets from the ruins of ancient Sumerian civilization. Most people expected these tablets to be boring. Tax records, grain inventories, business receipts, the everyday paperwork of a civilization that had been dead for thousands of years. And most of them were exactly that, boring. But in one of those crates, a researcher named Hermann Hilprecht found something that didn't fit. A list, a very specific kind of list, a list of kings. Not ordinary kings. Not kings from the few centuries before the tablet was written. These were kings from before the flood. Kings from before what the tablet itself described as the most devastating catastrophe in the history of the world. Kings from a world that, according to everything historians thought they knew at the time, should not have existed. The document is now called the Sumerian King List. It has been found in multiple copies across several archaeological sites in Iraq. The most complete and famous version is called the Weld-Blundell Prism, a 4-sided clay column about 20 centimeters tall, written in careful cuneiform script, now housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. Scholars can read it. Linguists have translated it. The Sumerian language is well understood. There is no mystery about what the words say. The mystery is what the words mean. Because the Sumerian King List begins with this. Alulim of the city of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Alaungar, also of Eridu, ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenluan of the city of Bad Tibur ruled for 43,200 years. Enmengalana of Bad Tibur ruled for 28,800 years. Demusa the shepherd of Bad Tibur ruled for 36,000 years. Ensip is a den of the city of Larak ruled for 28,800 years. Enmenduran of the city of Sippar ruled for 21,000 years. Ubartutu of the city of Shurapak ruled for 18,600 years. 8 kings, 5 cities, and a combined total reign of 241,200 years. And then, right after the last king's name, one single line that changes everything. Then the flood swept over. That's it. 5 words. And after those 5 words, the king list continues with a completely different scale. Post-flood kings rule for a few hundred years, then a few decades, then numbers we'd recognize as possible for a human being. The scale of time itself collapses after flood. Now, the obvious explanation, and the one mainstream academia settles for, is that this is mythology, exaggeration. Ancient people inflating the past to make their heroes seem larger than life. It's the same reason the Bible gives Methuselah 969 years. The same reason early Hindu texts describe kings ruling through astronomical time spans. Ancient people, the theory goes, use inflated numbers as a way of expressing greatness rather than actual duration. That's a reasonable starting point. But here's where it falls apart. The Sumerians were not casual storytellers. They were the inventors of writing itself. They developed cuneiform script specifically because they needed precise records, precise enough to track grain stores across multiple cities, manage irrigation systems for thousands of farms, and enforce legal contracts. They had a sophisticated base 60 mathematical system. Their astronomical records were precise enough that modern astronomers have confirmed their observations of planetary cycles. These were people who cared deeply about getting numbers right. And the way they formatted the pre-flood section of the king list was identical to the way they formatted the post-flood section, the section that describes real, verifiable historical kings. Same notation system, same tablet format, same type of document, no labeling that says this section is myth, no warning that these numbers are symbolic. They treated it as the same kind of record, historical record. So the question becomes, what were they working from? Because somebody at some point fed this information to the Sumerian scribes. Someone said, before the flood, there were these 8 kings, these 5 cities, these specific reign lengths. Who told them? And why did the Sumerians believe it enough to put it at the beginning of their official historical record? That question doesn't have a clean answer, but it has an important implication. The Sumerians believed something happened before the flood. Something organized enough to have city names and king names. Something record-worthy. Something real as far as they were concerned. And they weren't the only ones who believed it. Before we get into the 6 lost civilizations, we need to spend a minute on the obvious question. If this evidence exists, why isn't it in your history textbook? The answer is not a conspiracy. There is no shadowy organization hiding the truth. The real answer is something much more boring, and in some ways much harder to fix. It is called institutional inertia. Academic history has been built on a specific timeline since roughly the 1850s. That timeline says, human beings were nomadic hunter-gatherers until approximately 12,000 years ago. Agriculture appeared in a few places around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. The first cities and civilizations appeared around 5,500 years ago. Complex, large-scale civilization began around 4,000 years ago. This timeline was assembled carefully over many decades by thousands of smart, dedicated researchers. Universities organized their departments around it. Museums built their exhibitions around it. History textbooks worldwide repeat it as established fact. And here's a problem with old frameworks. Once an academic establishment builds its entire identity around one model of the world, evidence that challenges the model doesn't automatically update the model. What happens instead is that the evidence gets explained away within the existing framework, even when the explanation requires serious mental gymnastics. Dismissed as insufficiently proven, poorly sourced, or associated with fringe researchers. Quietly sidelined by the researchers who discovered it being denied funding, publication access, or university positions. This is documented. It is not theory. Robert Schoch, the Boston University geologist whose peer-reviewed research showed that the Great Sphinx shows water erosion consistent with a much older age, faced enormous institutional backlash. Not because its geological evidence was disproved. It hasn't been, but because the implications of that evidence made mainstream Egyptologists very uncomfortable. The objections to Schock's work have been mostly about what it would mean if he's right, not about the quality of the geology. And that is the problem. The evidence is not being evaluated on its merits. It is being evaluated on its implications. And that's not science. That's politics. The good news is that more and more of this evidence is accumulating to a point where dismissing it is becoming genuinely difficult. And when you lay it all out together, all 6 civilizations, all 6 bodies of evidence, the picture that forms is not easy to look away from. So let's go through them one by one. Antediluvian just means before the flood. It's a fancy word for a simple idea. There was a world that existed before catastrophe that the Sumerians recorded, and it was organized enough to have named cities and named kings. The 5 cities on the pre-flood Sumerian King List are not fictional. 3 of them have been found and excavated. Eridu is the most important. It is a real archaeological site in southern Iraq, near the modern city of Nazariah, and it shows continuous human occupation stretching back to approximately 5,500 BCE. When German and Iraqi archaeologists dug to the layers of Eridu, they found something significant, right in the middle of the occupational record. Sandwiched between evidence of human habitation below and human habitation above is a layer of waterlogged, water-deposited silt. Flood sediment. Not a minor flood. A significant, occupation-ending flood. A flood that covered the site completely and forced everyone to leave before people came back and built again on top of the layer. That is exactly what the Sumerian King List describes. A world before the flood, and then the flood, and then a world rebuilt on top of the ruins. Shuruppak has also been found. Modern archaeologists know it as Tel Farah in central Iraq. And at Shuruppak, they found the same thing, evidence of human occupation, a clear flood layer, and then more human occupation on top of it. The flood layer at Shuruppak is one of the thickest found anywhere in ancient Mesopotamia. In some places, nearly 2 meters of clean water deposited silt. Now, what caused this? The most compelling theory comes from oceanographers William Ryan and Walter Pittman, who published research in 2002 proposing that the ancient Black Sea, at the time a smaller freshwater lake sitting well below Mediterranean sea levels, was catastrophically flooded by Mediterranean seawater when a natural land barrier gave way. This barrier, which is now the Bosphorus Strait, appears to have failed sometime between 7,500 and 6,500 BCE. Ryan and Pittman estimated that when the barrier gave way, water poured through at approximately 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. The lake level may have risen several centimeters every single day. Shoreline communities would have been swamped within weeks, without warning, without escape. If people were living around the ancient Black Sea shores at that time, they would have witnessed a catastrophic, unstoppable, permanent inundation of their world. They would have fled in all directions. They would have told their children. Their children would have told their children. The memory would have lasted. That memory is the flood in the Sumerian King List. That memory is Noah. That memory is Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, who built a boat and survived while his world was swallowed. That memory is a universal flood myth found in over 200 independent cultures across every continent on Earth. The antediluvian world was real. The flood was real. The civilization that existed before may have been real too, real enough that thousands of years later, the Sumerians still remembered its names. That makes the antediluvian civilization the first of our 6 lost civilizations. Let me give you a number that should genuinely shake you. 12,000 years ago. Keep that number in your head while I describe what someone built 12,000 years ago in what is now southeastern Turkey. Massive T-shaped stone pillars, the largest of them 5 to 6 meters tall, and weighing up to 20 tons each, arranged in perfect circular enclosures. These pillars are carved, not scratched, not pecked randomly, but expertly, artistically, deliberately carved, with detailed reliefs of animals. Foxes, vultures, scorpions, cranes, aurochs, wild boar, gazelles. The larger central pillars in each enclosure have what look like belts carved around their middles and what appear to be human arms carved into their sides, suggesting they represent some kind of anthropomorphic, human-like beings. The site is enormous. The excavated area so far is just 5 to 10% of the total site, based on ground-penetrating radar surveys. Beneath the hill are dozens more enclosures, waiting. This is Göbekli Tepe, discovered in 1963 by a survey team that initially dismissed it as a Byzantine cemetery, then seriously excavated starting in 1994 by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt. Schmidt spent the rest of his life here, until his death in 2014. And what he found changed everything he thought he knew about the origins of human civilization. Here's the problem. Officially, 12,000 years ago, human beings were nomadic hunter-gatherers. No cities, no organized religion, no writing, no large-scale construction, no metal tools, no draft animals, no wheels, and yet someone built Göbekli Tepe, moving 20-ton limestone pillars from the quarry to the construction site, a distance of up to 500 meters, without wheels, without metal, without animals, required something. It required hundreds of people working together in a coordinated way, under clear direction, sustained over time. That means someone was giving orders. Someone was feeding the workers. Someone had a plan. Someone knew what the finished product was supposed to look like. That is not a wandering band of hunter-gatherers. That is a civilization. Professor Ian Hodder of Stanford University, one of the world's leading archaeologists, described Göbekli Tepe as requiring us to completely rethink the origins of complex society. Not adjust, completely rethink. The standard model said civilization came from agriculture. People settled down, started farming, and civilization grew out of that settled life. But Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture. It was built by people who, according to faunal and botanical evidence found at the site, were still hunter-gatherers. They were not farming. They were building, which means complex, organized, socially hierarchical civilization may have come first, and farming followed from it, not the other way around. That alone overturns 150 years of archaeological consensus. But here's the detail that should truly unsettle you. Sometime around 8000 BCE, roughly 4,000 years after the site was first built, someone deliberately buried Göbekli Tepe, not abandoned it, not left it to be covered slowly by drifting soil over centuries. Deliberately, intentionally, methodically filled it in. When Klaus Schmidt's team excavated the enclosures, they found that the fill material was not natural accumulation. It was a deliberate mix of topsoil, flint tools, animal bones, and the kind of surface debris you get from intentionally scooping up the surrounding landscape and using it to cover the monument. The act of filling in Göbekli Tepe was an organized project. It required effort, many people, sustained intention. Why would any group of people spend generations building the most extraordinary structure on Earth and then bury it? The theories are numerous. Ritual completion. The monument had served its purpose and was ceremonially returned to the earth. Preservation. They were protecting it from something they knew was coming. Sacred concealment. It was too important to leave exposed to whatever threat they faced. Memorial. They were covering a site that had become a place of mourning after some catastrophe. We don't know which, because we cannot read a single word these people left behind. They had no writing system that survived. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what they believed. We don't know what happened to them. We just know they built something extraordinary and then hid it from whatever came next. And whatever came next was us, and we almost didn't find it. Without Klaus Schmidt noticing that the Byzantine cemetery theory didn't hold up, and without the subsequent decades of careful excavation, Göbekli Tepe might still be sitting beneath that Turkish hillside, unknown, waiting, as it waited for 12,000 years before anyone found it. The builders of Göbekli Tepe are the second lost civilization. They had sophisticated architecture, organized society, ritual practice, and artistic ability. 12,000 years ago, and they left us their greatest monument deliberately buried, as if they wanted someone someday to find it. Let's talk about Atlantis. I know what you're thinking. Atlantis belongs in the same category as aliens building the pyramids and Bigfoot. It's the thing you bring up when you want to be dismissed from a serious conversation. But here's the thing. The reason Atlantis will not die, the reason it survived 2,400 years of skepticism, is not because people are credulous. It's because the original source is Plato. And Plato was not a storyteller. He was one of the most precise, rigorous, influential philosophers in the history of Western thought. and he described Atlantis not as a myth or a parable, but as documented historical fact. In approximately 360 BCE, Plato wrote two philosophical dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. These are core canonical texts of Western philosophy. They are read and studied in every major university philosophy department in the world. And in these texts, Plato describes Atlantis, the civilization, the geography, the timeline, the destruction. And he is specific. Very, very specific. The civilization existed approximately 9,000 years before his time, placing it at approximately 9,600 BCE. It was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. The capital city was organized in concentric rings of alternating land and water, connected by canals deep enough for large ships. The innermost island contained a royal palace and a great temple. The outer rings contained commercial ports, housing, and military facilities. The civilization had hot and cold running water supplied to individual buildings through a system of pipes, a navy of 1,200 ships, an army of 1,200,000 infantry soldiers, palaces and temples decorated with a metal called orichalcum, reddish in color, second in value only to gold. Control over territory both on the island and on surrounding continental land, including parts of what Plato describes as the European and African coasts. And then, in a single day and a single night, the gods, specifically Poseidon, sank the entire civilization beneath the sea as punishment for its people becoming corrupt and arrogant. Plato attributed this account to his ancestor Solon, the great Athenian lawmaker who had visited Egypt around 600 BC and heard it from Egyptian priests in the city of Sais. The priests told Solon that their records of Atlantis were 9,000 years old at the time of his visit, which traces the original events back to approximately 9,600 BCE. 9,600 BCE. Remember that date. Now, let's talk about what science has found. In 2007, a team of 26 researchers from universities across the United States, Canada, Denmark, and the United Kingdom published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most prestigious peer-reviewed scientific journals on Earth. The paper presented evidence for a comet impact event approximately 12,900 years ago that triggered catastrophic global consequences. The evidence they documented was found at sites across multiple continents simultaneously. A layer of microscopic platinum particles found at the same geological horizon, 12,900 years ago, at sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Platinum enrichment in sediment layers is a marker of extraterrestrial impact. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds that can only form under the extreme pressure of a cosmic impact, found at the same layer at over 30 sites across the globe. Evidence of massive wildfires at this exact time period, recorded in charcoal and soot layers found across North America and parts of Europe. A crash in populations of the world's large animals, mammoths, mastodons, American horses, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, American camels, all becoming extinct within the same 1,200-year window following this event. This was not a regional event. This was global. Something hit the Earth or exploded above it 12,900 years ago, and the consequences unfolded across every continent. The Younger Dryas impact event, as it came to be called, caused a sudden cooling of global temperatures that lasted approximately 1,200 years. Ocean circulation patterns disrupted. Ice sheets partially collapsed. Sea levels changed dramatically. The world that existed before the event was not the world that existed after it. Now look at Plato's date. 9,600 BC. That's approximately 11,600 years before today. And the Younger Dryas event? 12,900 years ago. The gap between them is about 1,300 years. Not a perfect match. But when you consider that the Younger Dryas cooling period itself lasted about 1,200 years, and that a civilization near sea level would not have been destroyed in a single instant, but over a period of decades or centuries as waters rose and climate destabilized, the time becomes much more interesting. If Atlantis was a real coastal or island civilization in the Atlantic region at the time of the Younger Dryas impact, it would have been destroyed by the combined effects of the impact itself, subsequent wildfires, sea level rise from partial ice sheet collapse, and a catastrophic disruption of the climate system that followed. Plato said it was destroyed in a single day and a night. A cosmic impact event could certainly feel that way to the survivors. A sudden catastrophe from which there was no recovery. There's one detail in Plato's description that was always used to prove Atlantis was invented. The metal he called orichalcum, a reddish gold metal, Plato said, that Atlantis had in abundance and considered second in value only to gold. No other ancient source described orichalcum in enough detail for anyone to know what it actually was. For centuries, it was assumed to be fictional, the kind of exotic material you invent when you're building a fictional world. In 2015, a team of archaeologists working with the Sicilian government was salvaging a ship that had sunk off the coast of Gela, Sicily, approximately 2,600 years ago. On the seabed, amid the wreckage, they found 147 metal ingots, reddish in color. Heavy. Italian scientists analyzed the ingots in a laboratory in Rome. The alloy turned out to be copper as the primary component, combined with zinc, lead, iron, and nickel in specific proportions. The combination produced a reddish color and a density that matched no standard ancient metal alloy in the archaeological record. The researchers published their findings and identified the metal as orichalcum because it matched Plato's description. The ship dated to the same era as Plato, which means orichalcum was not just a detail Plato invented for a fictional story. It was a real material being traded in the real Mediterranean world during his lifetime. If orichalcum was real, how many other details in his Atlantis account were real? This is the most debated of the 6 civilizations. The physical evidence is the thinnest. And I want to be clear about that before we go through it. But the reason it belongs on this list is not just physical evidence. It is also the remarkable convergence of cultural memory across a vast geographic area. The peoples of the Pacific, from the Aboriginal Australians to the Hawaiian Islanders, from the Filipino peoples to the coastal peoples of Indonesia and Melanesia, share a category of legend that appears independently across cultures with no historical contact. In almost every case, the legend describes a great land that once existed and now lies beneath the sea. Now you could say, every coastal people has legends about land lost to the sea. That's just what happens when you live near water that rises and falls. But the Aboriginal Australian case is different in a very important way. In 2015, a study was published in the Australian scientific journal Quaternary Science, reviews analyzing a collection of Aboriginal oral traditions describing specific coastal geography. The researchers took those descriptions, the shapes of bays, the positions of headlands, the presence of particular islands, and mapped them against known sea level data from the past 15,000 years. What they found was stunning. The oral traditions accurately describe the actual coastline of Australia as it existed approximately 12,000 to 7,000 years ago, right during the period when global sea levels were rising dramatically as the ice sheets of the last ice age melted. The descriptions were not symbolic. They were accurate, which means Aboriginal Australians have been passing down precise, reliable geographic memory of their coastline for up to 12,000 years through an unbroken oral tradition without writing. That is the oldest documented continuous human memory on Earth. And what that memory says at its core is land was lost beneath the sea, land that people lived on, land that is now underwater. That is not a myth. That is a documented historical event preserved in human memory for 12,000 years. In 1987, a Japanese diving instructor named Kahataro Aratake was exploring the waters off the Yonaguni Islands, the southernmost tip of Japan, close to the Taiwan Strait, when he found something he had not been looking for. Massive stone formations on the seafloor. Not random, not organic, angular, regular, with flat faces and what looked like steps. The Yonaguni Monument, as it came to be called, measures approximately 150 meters from east to west, 40 meters from north to south, and stand about 20 meters tall. Its shallowest point is about 5 meters below the surface. Its deepest point is about 27 meters down. Japanese marine geologist Masaaki Kimura spent 15 years diving at the site and studying every surface. He identified what he described as evidence of human workmanship, including a large, precisely tiered staircase-like formation with consistent step heights, pillars that appear to have been separated from the main rock face by cutting, A horizontal passageway running along the base of the main structure. Stone tablets with what appear to be deliberate markings on their surfaces. The overall form of a stepped pyramid-like structure with a flat top. Other geologists disagreed. They argued that the Yonaguni sandstone fractures naturally in angular, geometric patterns, and that what Kimura interpreted as human workmanship was natural geology. The argument has gone back and forth for decades without resolution. And without resolution, Yonaguni sits there, on the seafloor, 27 meters down in the current waters of the East China Sea, somewhere between clearly natural and possibly man-made. But here's the one thing that is not in dispute. The seafloor around the Yonaguni Islands was dry land approximately 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, before sea levels rose after the last ice age. If there was a civilization in this region during that period, Yonaguni would have been above water, on dry land, available to build on. And the time period, 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, lines up with the same window as Göbekli Tepe, as Atlantis, as a Younger Dryas impact. The same extraordinary, catastrophic, civilization-ending window of time. Here's a question that Egyptologists have never given a fully satisfying answer to. The ancient Egyptian civilization appears in the historical record around 3,100 BCE, fully formed. Complex hieroglyphic writing, sophisticated religious theology, advanced mathematics that can calculate the area of a circle and the volume of a truncated pyramid, architectural knowledge sufficient to align massive structures to true north with astronomical precision, detailed astronomical records of star cycles spanning thousands of years. It all just appears, already working, already sophisticated. In every other civilization we study, you see the learning curve. Pottery starts crude and becomes refined over generations. Writing starts as simple pictures and becomes complex symbols. Architecture starts small and imprecise and grows. You see the mistakes. You see the progress. In Egypt, the earliest writing we have found is already complex. The earliest architecture, the step pyramid of Djoser, built around 2,650 BCE, is already a stunning engineering achievement. It was built by a man named Imhotep who is described in the records as having restored knowledge, not invented it. It reads like people inheriting a tradition, not inventing one. The Egyptians themselves said exactly that. In Egyptian theology, the world before their civilization was called Zep Tepi the first time. This was not a mythological origin story in the way we normally think of them. The Egyptians described Zep Tepi as a real historical period when divine beings, the Netjeru, including Osiris, Isis, Thoth, and Horus, actually walked the earth, established the first civilization, built the first temples, taught humanity writing and mathematics and astronomy and agriculture, and then at a certain point, withdrew from direct involvement with the human world. The current age of Egypt, the Egyptians explicitly said, was not the first civilization. It was a restoration, a rebuilding of what had existed before. What they were building in dynastic Egypt, they believed, was a recreation of something older, greater, and more perfect that had been lost. The temples, the mathematical systems, the astronomical alignments. They were reconstructing the knowledge of Zep Tepi as faithfully as they could. That is not mythology. That is cultural memory of a predecessor civilization. The Great Sphinx of Giza is the largest monolithic statue on Earth, carved directly from the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau. It is 73 meters long, 6 meters wide, and 20 meters tall. Officially, it was built around 2,500 BCE by the pharaoh Khafre of the 4th dynasty. That date is not based on direct dating of the Sphinx itself. It is based on stylistic interpretation and the geographical proximity of the Sphinx to Khafre's pyramid complex. The Sphinx has never been definitively dated by direct scientific analysis of its stone. In 1991, Boston University geologist Dr. Robert Schoch published research in peer-reviewed scientific journals that challenged this date, not on stylistic grounds, but on geological ones. Schoch examined the erosion patterns on the vertical walls of the Sphinx enclosure, the pit carved into the bedrock around the Sphinx itself. What he found was textbook water erosion, rounded, undulating, vertically streaked patterns caused by water flowing down a surface over a sustained period of time. Not wind erosion, not sand abrasion. Those leave different marks. Water erosion. The problem is that the Giza Plateau has been desert for approximately 5,000 years. The region hasn't seen the kind of sustained, heavy rainfall that causes deep water erosion in all of recorded Egyptian history. For the Sphinx enclosure walls to show water erosion, they had to be exposed to heavy rainfall during a period when the region actually received it. The last time the Giza region had sustained heavy rainfall was the African humid period, sometimes called the Green Sahara, which ended approximately 5000 BC, about 7,000 years ago. Before that, during and after the last ice age, the region received significantly more precipitation. Shock's conclusion: the Sphinx was built before 5000 BC, possibly significantly before. Based on the estimated depth of erosion and the likely rainfall rates of that period, some geologists estimate the Sphinx could have been built anywhere from 7,000 to 9,000 BCE. The response from mainstream Egyptologists was swift and loud. But notably and importantly, they did not disprove the geological argument. They raised archaeological objections, that there was no other evidence of civilization in Egypt sophisticated enough to build the Sphinx at that date, that you would expect to find other artifacts if a pre-dynastic civilization had existed. And that's fair, but it's a circular argument. If a civilization was sophisticated enough to build the Sphinx and then disappeared, leaving no recognizable traces except the monument itself, that's exactly what we'd find. One enormous, inexplicable monument, surrounded by nothing, because everything else was destroyed or eroded or buried. There's also the inventory stele. The inventory stele is a stone tablet found at Giza in the 19th century, attributed to the reign of Khufu, the pharaoh officially credited with building the Great Pyramid of Giza. On this stele, Khufu refers to the Sphinx as a pre-existing monument. He describes repairs being done to a temple near the Sphinx. He treats it as something that was already there before his reign. If the stele is authentic and it has been examined extensively and its Egyptological validity, while debated, has not been disproven, then the Sphinx predates Khufu. And if the Sphinx predates Khufu, it predates the 4th dynasty entirely, which means someone built it before the Egypt we know as Egypt existed. Someone is Zep Tepi. Someone is the 5th lost civilization. The Indus Valley civilization, also called the Harappan civilization, is the most concrete and best documented of the 6 civilizations in this video. It is not disputed. It is not contested. It is a real, large, sophisticated civilization that archaeologists have been studying since its discovery in 1921. What makes it a lost civilization is one devastatingly specific fact. We cannot read a single word they wrote, not one word, in over 100 years of trying. At its peak, between approximately 2,500 and 1,900 BCE, the Harappan civilization covered an area of roughly 1.5 million square kilometers across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. It was larger than ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia combined. Its total population may have been as high as 5 million people, making it one of the most densely populated places on Earth at the time. And its cities were extraordinary. Mohenjo-Daro, meaning Mound of the Dead Men, had a planned, grid-based street layout. Streets ran on cardinal directions. Blocks were standardized in size. Buildings were built from kiln-fired brick to consistent dimensions. The city had multi-story buildings built on raised platforms to manage flooding, a comprehensive sewage system with covered drains running alongside every major street, access holes included for maintenance, individual bathrooms in private homes connected to that drainage system, a public structure called the Great Bath, built from tightly fitted baked bricks sealed with natural bitumen to make it watertight, fresh water wells in virtually every neighborhood block, so no resident was far from clean water. For comparison, London, England, did not have a comprehensive public sewage system until 1875 CE. Mohenjo-Daro had one 3,500 years earlier. And here's what makes the level of organization even more astonishing. The standardization across Harappan cities was exact. When researchers measured bricks at Mohenjo-Daro, they found they followed a ratio of 1 to 2 to 4. And when they measured bricks at Harappa, over 500 kilometers away, the same ratio, same dimensions, the same standard across the entire civilization's geographic range. Weights and measures found at trading sites across the Harappan world follow the same system. A unit found in a merchant's shop in Lodhal on the western coast of India matches the unit used by traders in Harappa in the Punjab. That kind of standardization requires a central authority. Someone was setting the standards and enforcing them across an enormous, geographically spread civilization. Some institution, some government, some administrative system. We have no idea what it was called, because we cannot read what they wrote. The Indus script has been found on approximately 5,000 objects. Steatite seals, copper tablets, pottery inscriptions, ivory rods, and bronze tools. The script contains somewhere between 400 and 600 distinct symbols, a number suggesting it may be logographic, syllabic, or a combination of both. It has never been deciphered. After over 100 years of effort by some of the world's finest linguists, cryptographers, and computational scientists, including machine learning algorithms specifically trained to identify patterns, the Indus script remains one of the last major undeciphered writing systems in human history. Why is it so difficult? First, there is no bilingual text. When scholars decoded Egyptian hieroglyphs in the early 1800s, they had the Rosetta Stone, a text written in both hieroglyphs and Greek, which scholars could read. For the Indus script, no equivalent exists. No inscription that says the same thing in both Indus script and a known language has ever been found. Second, the inscriptions are very short. The average Indus script inscription is about 5 to 6 symbols long. You cannot decode a language from samples that short. You need long text to identify grammatical patterns, common words, and structure. Third, and most fundamentally, we don't know what language the Harappan spoke. Some researchers believe it was an early form of Dravidian, the language family of southern India. Others believe it was completely independent, with no surviving relatives. Without knowing the underlying language, even a perfect translation key would be difficult to verify. What this means is 5,000 inscribed objects, a complete, developed writing system. Everything the Harappan civilization wrote about its laws, religion, science, history, trade, and daily life. And we cannot read one word. Whatever they knew, whatever they recorded, whatever wisdom they preserved in those 5,000 objects, it is as inaccessible to us as if it had never been written. And then, around 1,900 BCE, the civilization collapsed. Completely. The major cities were abandoned. The trading networks dissolved. The standardized weights and measures disappeared. The brick-making tradition ended. People scattered southward and eastward. The most widely accepted explanation is prolonged drought. Paleoclimatic evidence from sediment cores in the Arabian Sea and the Thar Desert suggests that the Indian subcontinent experienced a significant weakening of the monsoon system around 2000 BCE. Without monsoon rains, agriculture in the semi-arid Indus region would have failed within years. But the collapse was thorough and final. The Harappan urban tradition never recovered. The writing system was abandoned. The knowledge encoded in it, all of it, was simply lost. 5,000 objects. Not one readable word. That is the sixth law of civilization. Step back for a second. Look at all 6 of these civilizations side by side. Every single one of them ended in catastrophe. Not gradual decline. Not peaceful transition to a successor culture. Catastrophe. Sudden, overwhelming, civilization-ending catastrophe. The antediluvian civilization of the Sumerian records ended in a flood traumatic enough that every culture within 1,000 kilometers of Mesopotamia preserved its memory in detail for thousands of years. The builders of Göbekli Tepe either fled or were destroyed and deliberately buried their greatest monument before they went, as if preparing for something terminal. Atlantis, in Plato's account, sank in a single night. The Pacific civilization, if it existed, was drowned by rising seas. Zep Tepi, the pre-Egyptian civilization, vanished and left only its most durable monuments, with no surviving written record of its own history. The Harappan civilization collapsed so completely that its writing system was never used again. 6 civilizations, 6 catastrophic endings. And when you look at the dates, a cluster emerges that is very hard to ignore. The period between approximately 12,900 years ago and approximately 4,000 years ago contains a majority of these events, with the greatest concentration right around 12,900 years ago, the Younger Dryas impact event. The The scientific evidence for this event is solid and peer-reviewed. The platinum layer is real. The nano-diamonds are real. The global wildfire evidence is real. The megafaunal extinction is real. Something hit the Earth approximately 12,900 years ago, and the effects were felt across every continent. Now, and here's the key implication. If an advanced civilization existed anywhere near sea level before that event, what would have survived? Not organic materials. Not wood, textile, paper, leather. Fire and time destroy those. Not unburied metal. Corrosion and recovery and reuse over thousands of years destroy those. Not low-lying coastal cities. Rising post-glacial sea levels, which raise global ocean levels by over 100 meters between the peak of the last ice age and today, would have swamped them completely. What survives 10,000 or 12,000 years? Stone. Heavy stone, built large and buried deep under exactly the right conditions. And even then, only some of it. What this means is that the physical evidence for any civilization existing before the Younger Dryas impact is almost certainly thin. Not because the civilization was small or unsophisticated, but because the preservation conditions for that period are nearly impossible. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Not in geology. Not in archaeology. Especially not over this timescale. What has survived? The outliers. Göbekli Tepe, buried deliberately and preserved underground. The Sphinx, a massive carved bedrock feature too big to destroy. The Sumerian clay tablets, baked permanently hard by the fires that destroyed the libraries they were in. The oral traditions of coastal peoples who passed down geographic memories for 12,000 years. These are not comprehensive records. They are fragments. But the fragments are consistent. They all point in the same direction. A world existed before our world. More than one. Here's the thing that sits at the back of all of this and quietly refuses to leave. 7. 7 appears as a sacred number in almost every human culture, in almost every period of history, on almost every continent, in traditions with no historical contact with each other. 7 days of creation in the book of Genesis. 7 pillars of wisdom in the book of Proverbs. 7 wonders of the ancient world. 7 classical planets in ancient astronomy. The Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. 7 notes in the Western musical scale. 7 colors of the rainbow, as named by Isaac Newton. 7 heavens in Islamic tradition. 7 chakras in Hindu spiritual practice. 7 deadly sins in Christian theology. 7 sacraments. The universality of this number has always puzzled researchers. Why 7 specifically? Not 5, not 10, not 12, though those appear in other contexts. Why does 7 show up independently as sacred across so many unconnected traditions? One possibility, and I want to be clear this is speculative, not established, is that the number 7 carries an ancient memory, a memory shared by all of humanity before the civilizations of the current age diverged from their common source. A memory that says, 6 worlds came before, and we are the 7th. That's poetic. Maybe too poetic. Reality usually doesn't cooperate with poetry that neatly. But the underlying claim that we are the latest in a series of civilizations, not the first, is supported by real evidence. Evidence we have been walking through for this entire video. And if that underlying claim is true, then the question is not just historical. It is deeply personal, deeply practical. It is, what does this mean for us right now today? If the pattern is real, and the evidence increasingly suggests it is, then we are not just historical observers. We are participants. We are the generation that decides whether civilization number 7 ends the way civilizations 1 through 6 ended, or whether we finally break the cycle. And to break the cycle, you have to understand what caused it. Every previous civilization was blindsided by what destroyed it, not necessarily because the threats weren't there. Comets have always crossed the inner solar system. Climate has always been volatile. Sea levels have always responded to ice. But because civilizations don't naturally think in geological timescales, they think in years, decades, generations at most. The long-term existential risk gets ignored until it can't be. We are the first civilization, as far as we know, with the scientific capability to identify and potentially prevent at least some of those threats. We can track near-Earth objects with telescopes and satellites. We have early-stage theoretical plans for deflecting an asteroid if given enough warning. We understand the climate system well enough to model catastrophic scenarios. We can study geomagnetic pole reversals. We can see what's coming in ways no previous civilization could. But seeing and acting are very different things. The Tunguska event of 1908, a space object that exploded over Siberia with approximately the force of 15 megatons of TNT, flattened 2,000 square kilometers of forest. Had it detonated over a major city, the death toll would have been in the hundreds of thousands. No one tracked it. No one saw it coming. It just happened. The Chelyabinsk meteor 2013, approximately 20 meters across, exploded in the atmosphere above Russia and injured 1,490 people from the shockwave alone. It was not detected in advance by any monitoring system. The object that caused the Younger Dryas impact event is estimated to have been several kilometers across. Our current planetary defense capacity, while better than nothing, is not sufficient to prevent a Younger Dryas scale event. Not close. If that level of impact occurred today, we would be starting over. And our knowledge, how safe is it really? We feel comfortable about the preservation of knowledge in a way no previous civilization could, with our digital servers and redundant data centers and the internet. But what happens to all of that if a global catastrophe knocks out the power grid for a decade? What happens to the internet if the servers go dark? What survives of our accumulated civilization? If civilization suffers the same kind of reset that seems to have hit civilizations 1 through 6, the builders of Göbekli Tepe buried their monument deliberately. Maybe they knew something was coming. Maybe the act of burial was their version of backup, the most important knowledge of their world, encoded in stone, preserved underground, waiting for whoever came next. What is our version of that? I want to be completely fair with you about where the certainty ends, because you deserve that. Some of what we have covered in this video is very well established and beyond serious scientific dispute. The Sumerian King List is a real document in a Real museum, readable in the original Sumerian, and it genuinely records pre-flood kings with impossibly long reigns before a documented flood. Göbekli Tepe is a real site, genuinely dating to approximately 12,000 years ago, and was genuinely deliberately buried by whoever built it. The Younger Dryas impact event is supported by peer-reviewed research from dozens of institutions across multiple countries, published in top-tier journals. Robert Schoch's geological evidence for water erosion on the Sphinx enclosure is real, peer-reviewed, and has never been scientifically disproved, only objected to. The Indus Valley civilization is real, enormous, sophisticated. Its script remains undeciphered, and its collapse is documented in the archaeological record. And some of what we have covered is genuinely interpretive, real evidence, but open to multiple readings. Whether Atlantis was a real place or a philosophical device Plato used to make a moral argument, whether the Yonaguni Monument is man-made, naturally occurring, or some combination, whether Lemuria ever existed as a civilization rather than just a geological predecessor landmass, whether the number 7's cross-cultural significance reflects a shared pre-civilizational memory, whether the Sumerian King List long reign lengths represent actual records of ancient civilization or are symbolic in nature. These questions are open, and the fact that they're open is not a reason to dismiss them. It's a reason to study them, seriously, with proper funding and proper scientific attention. Because if the pattern is real, the implications are enormous. And if even part of the pattern is real, if even 3 of the 6 civilizations we've discussed are genuine predecessors to our own, then we are missing a significant portion of the human story. A portion that might contain exactly the information we need to understand how civilizations end and what can be done to prevent it. Come back to that clay tablet one more time. The Weld-Blundell Prism, 4-sided, about 20 centimeters tall, sitting behind glass in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, written in careful cuneiform by a scribe who lived approximately 4,000 years ago, who was himself preserving records that may have been ancient when he received them. This scribe was not writing mythology. He was doing what scribes do. He was recording what his civilization knew, what had been passed down, what was considered fact, and what had been passed down to him was 5 cities, 8 kings, 241,200 years of rule, and then a catastrophic flood that ended it all. He was trying to tell whoever came after him. There was a world before this one, and it ended. Now add to that the builders of Göbekli Tepe, who constructed the most extraordinary monument on Earth 12,000 years ago, and then buried it. Add Plato's account of Atlantis, sourced Egyptian priests preserving 9,000-year-old records. Add the water erosion on the Sphinx that a trained geologist says cannot have formed in the last 5,000 years. Add the 5,000 unread inscriptions of a civilization larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Add the Aboriginal oral traditions accurately describing coastlines that vanished 7,000 years before anyone wrote them down. Put all that together, and you get something bigger than any single piece of evidence. You get a pattern, a recurring story of humanity building something beautiful and then losing it, building again, losing it again, building again, building again, building again, 6 times. We are in the building phase of civilization number 7. We have been for roughly 5,000 years. Compared to the civilizations that came before, if the Sumerian records are any guide, we are very, very young. And we are in possession of something that no previous civilization, as far as we know, had knowledge of the pattern. Not because we invented the pattern, because the survivors of the civilizations before us encoded it in their records, their monuments, their myths, and their mathematics, and left it for us to find. The Sumerians wrote it on clay. The Egyptians carved it in bedrock. The builders of Göbekli Tepe buried it under a Turkish hilltop. Plato wrote it in Greek. The Aboriginal Australians sang it across 60,000 years of oral tradition. They all tried to pass something down. They all tried to make sure the next civilization, us, would at least know something had existed before. Now it is our turn to decide what to do with that knowledge. Because knowing the pattern means you can try to break it. You can build institutions that take long-term existential risk seriously, not as an afterthought, but as a central organizing principle. You can invest in tracking near-Earth objects and developing the capability to deflect them. You can preserve human knowledge in forms that survive catastrophic disruption. You can study the ends of previous civilizations not as historical curiosities, but as survival guides. The Sumerians knew there was a world before theirs. They wrote it down. They kept the record. They did everything they could to make sure whoever came next, us, would know something had existed. Now the question is, are we building something worth passing down? And are we building it carefully enough to survive what ended everything before? Because whatever came for civilizations 1 through 6 didn't hate them. Comets don't hate. Floods don't hate. Climate shifts don't hate. They just happen. And they will happen again. We are civilization number 7. And the best thing we can do with that knowledge, the only thing that makes the pattern mean something more than tragedy, is take it seriously.